The People's Market is pleased to be associated with the movement that empowers.
Since December the 29th, 2019, we have been traversing our island and introducing you to the social history of traditional Barbadian communities. Housing and community businesses were featured in almost every episode. We also discuss their subsequent transformation, that is, the improved housing and business infrastructure that later came about in these communities. Over the years, many community members celebrated the work of the credit union movement in providing the necessary finance to improve their lot, and so transformed their communities with the necessary amenities. More importantly, they celebrated their elevation from the poor and underprivileged class to home ownership and shareholders in this movement. For the next 3 weeks, we will pause and pay homage to this movement that has built and continues to build Barbadian communities. Good governance is a primary factor in the smooth operation of any organization, any community, or any movement. It promotes social justice and equity, and it brings about the policies that take into account the needs of the marginalized and vulnerable segment of our population. It also helps to reduce inequality, and it ensures that benefits reach all segments of the community and the movement.
We all need some form of governance. People might say that we don't want, people might not like a governance process, but in reality, if we have one society here to another one there, how do we relate to the nation? How do we relate to the region? How do we communicate with one another? How do we get information from each other? So in other words, if we want to deal with the Jamaican credit union concept, so to speak, we can't expect that every society would write a letter to the Jamaican League, as the case may be. So that's but you see, so it was important to have a body that effectively looks after the concerns of the grouping and so be able to sort of bring life to those concerns. So the league took on, that was the position of the league in the early days. And what I could say, one of the first development officers in the league, in the early days, was a chap called Oriel Doyle. And Doyle was a very powerful individual as far as pulling institutions together, as far as selling the concept. And if we check, in a lot of cases, a lot of the smaller institutions, and even in the case of COB, which is the second largest, you know, it is said here that even the guy who was the energy behind the movement to have COB registered, that again, Oriel Doyle was ensuring he was sharing the concept and ensuring that the people understand what credit unions was and how they could work for the people.
So it was not really a working class, sensitive kind of situation when it comes to financial services in Barbados at the time. Fortunately, at that time, I was about to finish university. And in my final year, I did a couple of papers on worker participation and those kind of issues. So when I saw this job advertised for a credit union development officer, I thought that was an excellent opportunity to try to put into practice some of the things that I was studying at university. And in fact, even in my final week of examinations, I actually took up the job. So when I was asked by the directors at the time of the credit union league if I was really serious about this, because a young person in the credit union movement at that time was hardly anything anybody would have seen. But I thought it was an excellent opportunity to try to change the world. Most people who leave university they come up with this idea, listen, I have all this knowledge now, how can I alter life, how can I change the situation for the country as a whole. So I saw it as an opportunity to put in practice what I was studying for a while. And I didn't realize what I was really stepping into at the time, but when I was eventually given the job, I think I had about 2 or 3 other candidates, but they were not as young as I was at the time. So the director is meant for youth, recognizing, but I didn't know it, that it called for a lot of work and a lot of traveling. So the aim at that time was to strengthen the credit union movement, which was really in a fairly sad state because we had about 12 credit unions at the time. The total assets were just about $100,000 for the entire movement. And most of the boards consisted of persons over the age of 50 and 60. So it was an old people's kind of thing. It really emerged out of the friendly societies activities where they then concentrated on money alone rather than the other side of friendly societies, which dealt with medical and life, that kind of thing. So they wanted to concentrate on emphasizing, utilizing your financial resources to improve oneself. So that I thought that was a good opportunity, and I took the job. So it was not an easy situation because the league's office was then centered at Gibson House, which was at that time on Price Street. Gibson House was the headquarters of the Barbados Nurses Association. So they allowed us to rent a room. And at that time, the central bank was being erected. So you can imagine amongst the heat, no AC, and dust coming from the central bank right across the road, it was not an easy place to be at the time. But it was an office. And having been a teacher before, sitting in an office was a luxury, even though it was hot and dusty, among other things. So we started work there. I had a secretary. And within 3 weeks, the Jamaica Credit Union League was having its convention. And I was given a ticket and said, go to Jamaica, see what they're doing out there, see if you can help us. When I touched down at the airport, I was shocked, I was surprised. They sent a limousine for me. I said, what? The credit union? That's a limousine? So I was a guest of honor at that first convention. That wasn't the first, at their convention. And I was introduced to a number of people who expressed significant interest in what we were doing in Barbados and offered to help at their own expense. So when I returned to Barbados with all these ideas now, because having seen the Jamaica situation where credit unions were operating like banks, where directors were really interested in the development of people. Where I remember one gentleman telling me, when you were speaking to credit union people, make sure you listen to them. Right? Always be patient with them, because they always have ideas that can help you. And I took that with me up to now, because the simplest of persons that you speak to, they always give you some ideas to how you can improve, not only yourself, but the lives of others. So I took a lot from that Jamaica trip. And when I came back, I was then advised that, listen, if you need to get this credit union movement going, you have to do 2 things. 1, start a credit union with a large member base, and 2, get a lot of young people involved. Because as I said before, the movement was primarily of older people, and young people were not too keen on associating with older people as they are today. Right? So I, one day I was walking the street just about a couple of yards from my office, and I met a guy called Peter Earl. He was a schoolmate of mine. And he asked me what I was doing. I said, I have this job that it requires me to develop the credit union movement, and then putting plans in place to try to do that. So he asked me what was that. And that started a situation where he got 5 people, I got 5 people, and we pulled together a team, and that started the City Bridgetown Credit Union, just from a simple conversation on the street.
At that time, I was employed at PricewaterhouseCoopers as an auditor. And one day, I was unassigned, and I had to pay a bill in Robert Street. And I decided that I was going to walk up to Robert Street to pay that bill. On my way to that place, at the corner of Price Street and Robert Street, I ran into Oriel Doyle. We were old schoolmates from Campbellmere, and we started to talk about what we were doing, each was doing, that type of thing. And I asked him what he was doing, and he told me that he was working at the Barbados Cooperative Credit Union League. I don't think I had ever heard about the Credit Union League at that time. So he invited me to go to his office and allow him to explain to me what credit unions were about. At that meeting, I was so enthusiastic about the credit unions and what they were offering that I told him, look, Oriel, I would like to join now. But he said, Peter, you cannot join any of the existing credit unions, because remember, they were operating in terms of certain bonds. You had to be a member of a public servant to be a member of the Barbados Public Workers Cooperative Credit Union. You had to be a member of the police, etc., etc. So he said to me, well, tell you what, if you get 5 persons and I get 5 persons, then we could start the credit union. Well, I went ahead and I got 6 persons. The first person I remember talking to, of course, was my wife, Maureen. And Maureen was very close to Winston's wife, Mona. And we invited them over, had a discussion with them. The other people that were founder members was my first business partner, the late Dr. Royal Daniel and his wife, Marina Daniel. And we invited them. And then, in addition to that, Oriel then, he got about 4 other persons, Mitchie Holder, Curtis Moore, and Mervyn Rollins, and one other, Fitzroy Doyle. And we came together. We start looking at the bylaws, and that was basically the origin of the credit union. But it was because we saw the benefits of what a credit union could offer, and we wanted to cash in on that. That we looked at forming the credit union. Plus, I think Oriel was on a mission to change the whole environment, to change the whole attitudes and things in terms of the credit union movement. And he wanted to create a new set of credit unions that were different, because at that point in time, credit unions were managed by older people. People associated credit unions with old folks. So we were the first set of young persons that were in the movement. I remember he also told me about the city of Kingston in Jamaica, which is what we patterned ourselves after. And what was particularly interesting about that credit union was that they own a multi-story building in Jamaica, and they employ university graduates. Now, this was unheard of in Barbados. And so there were lots of things that sort of motivated us to wanting to start a credit union.
We spoke to Oriel. They made contact with the city of Kingston, and they sent over 2 persons, executives, Neville Rowan and Trevor Blake. And we sat and we had meetings, and he said, no, do not be disturbed if you don't get the traction that you're looking for. Then we also spoke to the late Sir Harcourt Lewis, who was one of the founders of Public Workers Credit Union. He said, Winston, do not get upset if you don't get. And that was the sort of the trend. You're going to get some pushback. And the first thing that people started to ask us was, who is going to trust you young people with their money? And I thought, well, it was quite a fair question, because we knew nothing about credit unions, little about finance, but we knew that there were benefits to be had. So we thought, well, we can try this here, even if the only thing that can happen is a failure. So we went on and we did that. And Peter, our first, our venture into getting membership, we spoke to a friend of ours who had a small printery, Michael Newton. And Michael said, I said, well, Michael, we need to advertise that we're looking for members in the credit union, that we want to start this new credit union. He said, well, if you, Winston, if you are in it, it got to be good. So he said, he printed 1,000 flyers for us free of cost, and we distributed them around the place, and people said, okay. And it started to grow. It was phenomenal because within the first 2 years, Peter, I think we had, by 1985, we reached about around 4,000 members. I mean, that's 83, and then by 85, and then we had our first building, and we shared the office with the league at Sprite Street.
So as that continued, we realized that for a credit union to develop and develop quickly, it needed full-time service. And my simple office then, for the first 2 years, was the office of the Celebration Credit Union, and my secretary at that time was the clerk. So she worked for me as well as for the credit union without compensation, right? For a while. So we sacrificed a lot, and we got a lot of volunteers involved because it really required, a lot of volunteer work.
So we didn't have any employees, so we had, Miss Marcia Norville then was working with the league, so she would update the books and so on for people who were joining. So we shared that office with the league until 1987 when we bought our first property at Pinfold Street. So from there it grew, and every time we moved, the membership just exploded in growth. And I mean, it was long before we had to make an addition onto the building that we had at Pinfold Street. But then we had to move again because the lines were going through the door. So we had, of course, it made an opportunity for us to hire staff. So we had our first employee though that shared the office with League was Sanji Yearwood. Yeah, she was the first employee. So then, as time grew on, we had added more staff, but it kept growing. It was listed in the World Council as one of the fastest growing credit unions in the Western Hemisphere. But
it was striking to me because having spoken to people, you realize that there was a serious need for the existence of an organization just like that. One of the meetings we had, we asked to meet the staff of the then Woolworth company at the time, on behalf of the Celebration Credit Union. And they took us in the lunchroom and we met a number of staff there. And when we finished speaking, one lady in the back said, listen, I'm drawing my meeting today. I have $500. I'm putting it in right now. And that was the first deposit that credit union had, $500, right? And that lady, I think she died about last year. But she reminded me of how the Barbadian spirit is. You know something is good for you, and you're willing to put whatever you have to support it. Because she recognized then that this is something that will help her and her colleagues. And it really did. In fact, at another place about probably 2 or 3 weeks after, we were speaking to another group, and they joined as well. But then within a week, one of the ladies had a problem and needed a loan badly. Of course, Craig only had $1,200 at that time. You know, they gave her the loan for $800. And that is how it started.
And there's one other point that has to be made. And it is that
credit unions have been growing steadily between the late 70s and the early 80s. But then we had a kind of a recession, economic went into recession, and bank credit became more difficult, and also higher purchase arrangements. And people who were leading the movement thought it wise to approach the government to ask for a concession in terms of tax allowances on the savings.
The government in the 1980s and 1990s saw it fit to not only protect but to incentivize these credit unions by allowing members of the credit union to receive benefits having signed up for the credit union.
In 1979, I attended a correspondence by the Israeli government on the history and development of cooperatives. And when I was there and talking about credit unions, I understand at that point that the Jamaican government, in order to promote the growth and development of credit unions, had amended the Cooperative Act so that the members can benefit. So I thought that was a very good idea. So I came back here then. Boyce was on the board, and he told about the Boyce. And for a while, a couple of months passed, and then he's busy. But eventually, he wrote the government.
At first, he was not too enthusiastic, but O'Brien Chapman, in fact, O'Brien Chapman was the person who introduced me to him, and so Chapman did a lot of the background work in terms of getting things to happen.
Suppose I called his name Steve Hemtage. I asked, Brother Steve, you think that the government would give favorable consideration to tax concession? He said, of course. Right? Write a letter to the Prime Minister. I did that in 1979. In 1980, in the budget, only one letter. I don't think I had a salary reminder. It was I started the books. It was one of the fastest things that changed that I see happen.
The Tom Adams government approved it, right? And it was a shot in the arm. In fact, that move is one of the factors that caused an increase in the number of credit unions that were being registered.
He implemented a tax-free arrangement where once you save in the credit union movement, whatever you save, you can make a claim on your income tax. That was so popular and that swelled the numbers of the credit union movement, especially the public workers credit union. Because here it is, you are now given assistance by government to save. And that was a significant boost. In fact, that more than anything else contributed to the significant growth of the movement between the 80s and the 90s. That in itself really helped a lot.
It was a spurt on the books, or spurt in registration on the books. And some of those credit unions that were registered are still doing very well today. Right, still doing very well today. The amount was increased a few years after, and in fact the increase went up to I think about $3,000 until there were later economic setbacks.
1 year you mentioned it in next year's tax concession, and then it started I think with about $3,000 a year, and then it gradually increased and went up to $5,000. Now the interesting thing about the tax concession, you see. At one point, the credit union was seen as an organization for middle class or just below the middle class. Yeah. And certain persons then above that found that the first thing, the loan limit was very low. So they had no interest in joining the credit union to get these small loans when they can walk in the bank. But from the time we decided to implement the tax concession, persons, for instance, who saved, I remember, $3,000 a year in saving, was able to reduce their tax liability by $1,200. So by saving the credit union, at that point in time, we wanted to increase the loan limit. So in order to increase the loan limit, we had funds then come in. First thing is at the floor. So that way we were able then to incrementally increase the tax concession. But Boyce is the person.
And that, in the 1980s and 1990s, led to the increased membership of the credit union, so that people who had signed up for the credit unions, those numbers grew significantly in the 1990s. And that was important because people could now get their first car, their house, their land through the credit union system, and not necessarily depending on the foreign banks. Okay.
But to get back to this point I just made, we need to re-establish the fact that we should have tax concessions on savings with the credit unions. As I said, the then minister would say, you asked me to give people this thing. I say, yeah, but you do it for other people.
No doubt that call from Ralph Boyce for the return of the concession is echoed throughout almost every Barbadian community. This has been episode 3 of a special mini-series of My Community as we look at the transformative work of a strong movement in Barbados that continues to transform and build Barbadian communities. I'm Sherwood McCaskey.
The People's Market is pleased to be associated with the movement that empowers.